Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Tamara Thorpe, and I am the host of today's podcast. Today, we are focusing on Chapter 5, Needs Assessment and Data Analytics, Understanding Your Constituencies. And I am here with the author, Neil Legler. I'm real excited to be here today to talk to Neil about needs assessment. It's often a critical step in the process of building out a mentoring program that can be overlooked. And so I'm really excited that we have someone here today who really specializes in this area. Neil is the director of the Center for Innovative Design and Instruction at Utah State University. He's got over 20 years experience in instructional design and training, and also consults faculty and staff at Utah State, and has had a really significant, a major role in implementing technology systems, including the establishment of the Journal on Empowering Teaching Excellence. And so we are here with someone who I am confident is going to help us really understand the importance of needs assessment, and more importantly, how to remove barriers for any program coordinators who are out there building mentoring programs to building in needs assessment. So hello, Neil, welcome.
Hello, thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here today.
Terrific. Well, I want to just jump right in, and I want you, if you could just tell us, what does needs assessment mean?
Yes, that's a great starting point. So needs assessment is really simplified as defining it as identifying the gap between the results that you want to be achieving in your program, the desired results, and the results that you're actually achieving. And then basically describing that as clearly as possible, and getting agreement among your stakeholders. Actually, in the process of needs assessment, you normally identify multiple gaps in the results that you're trying to achieve, and what you're actually achieving. So it also involves a certain degree of prioritizing the needs that you're most concerned about, and then working backwards from there to find appropriate solutions.
Okay, so imagine, right? I'm in an organization, whether it be higher ed or a private industry, and we're noticing a variety of gaps. And somebody says, mentoring works, and so why not just build a mentoring program? Why is doing a needs assessment important?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that is a very typical scenario in training and mentoring in any program like this. Normally, the idea for the program comes before the actual formal identification of a gap in needs, and so it is easy for people involved in the process to say, well, we know what we need. We need a mentoring program. We need more money. We need more staff. These are what we refer to in our chapter as felt needs. So they're things that we feel that we see as being what we need, but they aren't necessarily needs in the sense of that gap that needs to be filled per se. So the discipline that comes to the developer, the discipline required, I should say, of the developer of a mentoring program or a training program is the discipline to be able to say, that sounds like it's probably a fantastic idea. Let's back up a step and let's take a look at why we feel like we need this. Let's take a look at what exactly we're trying to do that we aren't doing now. And we may very well come out of that and say the solution is mentoring or the solution is training. But on the other hand, we also may come out of that and say, oh, there's some additional solutions. There's some additional things we can do that actually we need to do for this to succeed. And I guess really the takeaway, one of the big takeaways for this chapter is the temptation is strong to skip that initial needs assessment, that initial analysis step, but the consequences can actually result in the solutions that you implement not working because you actually miss some important components of what the needs are, and you don't involve the right people in actually getting buy-in on some of those solutions that you select, or in identifying exactly what needs to be done. So the takeaway is that needs assessment is an easy process to skip and an important one to have the discipline not to skip.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because very often folks underestimate, one, the complexity of mentoring and building out a mentoring program. And mentoring can be so impactful, but if we don't get it right, then folks can end up thinking, well, then mentoring isn't the solution, when it is the solution, but there may have been other components, whether because sometimes I'll talk to folks and they said, well, we tried to get a mentoring program off the ground, but we couldn't find mentors, or students or staff weren't interested, or it turned out that we didn't have X, Y, and Z. And what I think I hear you saying is a lot of that can really be identified and factored in for with a good needs assessment process.
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely. Yeah, one of the questions to ask yourself is really, if this mentoring program, what will cause this mentoring program to fail if we don't address it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Because there are oftentimes other organizational factors that can play a role, that can cause that also need to be addressed simultaneously with mentoring or with training. And
Yeah.
like you said, you don't want to be caught with your mentoring program or your training program failing, and therefore scuttling future efforts in mentoring and
Correct.
training because of things that maybe you could have addressed that are outside of that scope.
So when we're talking about a needs assessment, right, if I've already started, it's not too late to do a needs assessment. How much time are we talking about in general? Is this something I could, when you say take a step back, I think of every client I have going, what? Take a step back. We already told, the leadership that this was happening.
That is a great question, and I would say I would be a little hesitant to give a specific number answer in terms of time required. I do a little bit worry as the reader goes through the chapter that needs assessment will look perhaps bigger and more overwhelming than it probably ought to be in the reader's case. Because with this particular chapter, I mean, we really gave a summary of a lot of needs assessment literature and took really a 10 times magnification view of the needs assessment process, where we really looked and said, okay, here are some existing and popular models. Here is one that works for large committees and large budgets. Here's what needs assessment generally needs to entail no matter what. Here is a step-by-step run through of all sorts of different things you might consider. And here's a non-comprehensive but still kind of lengthy list of methods. But in the end, what I hope the reader gets coming out of this is that they don't have to do everything that's in here. The main idea is that they just need to make sure they do only what's needed to get the information they need to make a decision. They don't need to go further than that. They shouldn't go further than that. So, that might take a while
Yeah.
if it's a big process. But my guess is that for something like mentoring, we're not looking at implementing, we're looking, this chapter looked at literature that's like for the World Bank, or for, if we're
Right.
implementing massive, public works programs or whatnot. For mentoring, we can scale it down a little bit. The main key is that we need to spend enough time to identify what our needs are. So we start out by collecting data, and a lot of times that data is available already somewhere in the organization. So especially at institutions, we have information available in the CRM, we have information available in the student information system, we have information that might be available in Canvas or in other locations. We identify what information we can get our hands on. It is usually important, I would say it's to do a good job with needs assessment, you're usually going to want to collect some additional information on top of that, because the information that's already available probably wasn't compiled for your particular program. And so maybe you need to be able to get some additional information to help you make sense of it.
Yeah.
So there can be some time spent in, I would recommend doing some kind of a combination of simple quantitative, a relatively small survey, and spend some time in interviews and focus groups, get some qualitative information. And then make sure you take the time to have your stakeholders involved through the process of analyzing that information and then deciding what stands out and making solutions. And so I think if I were to sort of, I may get myself in trouble for doing this, for saying this, but because I can be notorious for sometimes seeing something as being able to be done a lot faster than
Yeah. Yeah.
organizational realities sometimes result in, when you're bringing in people with mixed schedules, and you're also
Yeah.
doing this on top of your other day job. Kind of setting all of that aside and assuming that everybody's available and you're able to set the time aside, I would
Yeah.
feel like you could probably pull off a pretty decent needs assessment in 2 to 3 weeks, um,
Yeah.
and
Yeah. I
have a
think it's
lot of
interesting.
information. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think your chapter does share a lot of resources that kind of allow people to plug and play, right? If you are starting at needs assessment and you have a strategic plan with a long runway, you could probably create a pretty robust needs assessment process. If you're like, some folks who are maybe put the cart before the horse and you are already partially in, but need to take a step back, you're not talking about people spending 6 months to a year building out a needs assessment. Depending on, you could probably get it done pretty quickly with some relatively accessible strategies. And so I really like that. In your chapter, you very specifically went through a lot of the pros and cons of different types of tools like a survey or focus groups or interviews, and we'll talk a little bit about those in a moment. But I do like the idea that your chapter does, it provides a robust amount of information that people can really take from and build something that's going to make sense for their time, their resources, their timeline. And I also appreciated that you really speak to you combining that with existing data, because or as you said, in higher institutions there's a lot of information, and lots of organizations are collecting a lot of data on their people engagement, Glint, Gallup, like there's tons of surveys. And so, using all that data can be really helpful. But you spoke to a point about involving stakeholders in the process. So can you talk a little bit about why, if you're going to do a needs assessment process, why inclusion is an important part of that process?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. Mentoring, any kind of a program that occurs at a higher education institution, anytime we implement a program, it is inherently political. So that would be one reason. There are of many, but when we talk about implementing a program, we are talking about taking finite resources of money, time, people, and moving them away from one thing to another thing. And it means then that we want to be able to make sure we have buy-in from the people who are making some of those allocation decisions, so that it's clear that our program is important and valuable, and that it targets very specific organizational goals. So stakeholders, of course, can mean a mix of people, and I think it goes without saying that there's the stakeholders to whom we report. There's the stakeholders that we seek to serve. There's our student base or our staff population that we're seeking to help. And as intuitive as it sounds to say that we should get get input from our students or from our staff or from the people we're trying to create these programs for, I know from personal experience and long involvement in the work of higher education that so often that's a step that's really easy to skip. That's easy. It's easy to say to ourselves, I've been working with these students for years. I've been working with these faculty or staff for years. I've spoken with so many. I have a real sense of what needs to be provided to them. But we always get better information when we involve those people that we're trying to serve. One of the things we talk about in the chapter, in terms of, it's not necessarily directly related to identifying who our stakeholders are, but it is part of the process of identifying what our needs are. And I think it applies to stakeholders, is trying to understand the level that we're looking for results in. So, and this gets maybe a little bit, I don't know, when I first started thinking about this, it felt maybe a little bit too like in the clouds, but really we are, as an institution, trying to accomplish some societal goals.
Right.
We are trying to have an impact on our communities, on society writ large. We're trying to churn out, churn out's maybe the wrong word, but we're trying to turn out students who are going to make a positive impact for good. And maybe we actually want to start thinking at that level. Maybe in putting together a mentoring program, maybe there's something that we're trying to help our outgoing students or staff do that we hope has a greater community impact or an industry impact or something along those lines. And so if that's the case, I think it at least bears taking a moment to think, even if we don't go there, it bears taking a moment to think, at what level am I really trying to address this gap? Do I need to involve somebody from the community or from industry? Or is it enough to bring in somebody from the department? Or is it enough to bring in the people that I'm serving? But basically, just have a sense, have an understanding of the level you're trying to address, and then bring in the people who are involved in that so that you can get their input and their buy-in, so that you, one, can help make sure that the program's sustainable. Two, help make sure that if you get hit by a bus, or if there's a leadership change, or some sort of a socioeconomic what's the word I'm looking for? Geopolitical event
Yeah.
that changes the game for a while. That there's enough experience already in the process that you've been doing that you don't lose track
Yeah.
of what you're trying to do. And then 3, to make sure that you're actually creating services that address the people you're trying to serve appropriately, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. No, thank you for that clarity. I think it's helpful to put what is in the chapter in perspective. And so to that, so what are some preconditions for a needs assessment?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it is helpful just up front to know. I mean, you definitely need to know what kind of a runway you have. So you need to know how much time you have. You need to know if you have any kind of a budget. You need to know who you can involve, who you have access to. You should probably up front have a list of names or at least people you can go to get help in collecting desired, like the data and things that you need. Um, and I would say those are kind of the main things going in.
Yeah.
Have that buy-in that a needs assessment is a good idea, and people who are willing to participate with you.
Yeah, and a lot of those preconditions are already at our disposal, right? But it is really taking that step back, identifying, right, what are the resources, what do we have access to, who's going to help us in that process. I think those are all really important factors to consider, which I then think feed into the different types of methods of collecting data, right? So you've talked about qualitative versus quantitative, and in the chapter you share a variety of methodologies. And so if so I'm wondering, you've already sort of spoken to it, but I'm wondering in terms of assessment, particularly when we're talking about being inclusive and looking at reaching out to different stakeholders. Is there any combination you recommend? Is there any sort of what's going to be something that if you have smaller scope is going to be more feasible, if you've got a greater scope are going to be, better at getting you more robust data?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. I do feel like there's always, if you have the time and if you have the money, and I do feel like that is important. You may be under the gun, and if you're under the gun, something is better than nothing. Like if you have the ability, it's a good idea to combine some quantitative and some qualitative data collection. And of your own. So first of all, one of the first things obviously you want to do before you really even start collecting data is find out who has the existing data in your office. Go to them, see what they can do to help you out and to pull data. I know in my office, I'm frequently, even though we're not the office that collects and analyzes existing data, we're the office that manages the systems, some of the systems that have a lot of the data. And as such, we're kind of closely adjacent to those offices that have that data.
Okay.
And so I get a lot of requests from faculty, from department heads, from program coordinators saying, I need certain data. What can you help me get? And then I'm able to kind of help direct them to the people who can provide that data. And so I would always probably just start there.
Right.
see what you can get, because it's the fastest way to get data, because it's already available. But it does take some digging usually to find who can give that to you. And you might not know who that person is right off the bat. So you might need to ask around. But if you can go to the people who manage those systems, or who support those systems, they can usually help point you in the right direction.
Okay.
So and then probably the next most important thing I would probably do is, if I didn't have a lot of time, is I'd at least try to bring a focus group together or do some interviews where I'm just talking to people and asking questions. More than one person, try to get a variety of different perspectives. And then if you have the time, you should try to pull in some additional quantitative data in the form of surveys. And with needs assessment, there's a specific kind of style of question that is often recommended. So in your surveys, so there's this idea of a double scale needs assessment item that we talk about in the chapter. So you basically ask things like, to what extent is this important to you? Or you might provide a series of needs or potential solutions that basically get at what is and what should be. So that can look a couple of different ways. So that could be, how important is this to you? How often do you use it? Or how how useful would, how ideal would this be? To what extent would this be ideal? To what extent does this actually exist? So you're really asking just directly in your surveys for somebody to tell you that gap. And then you can just use your 1 to 5 Likert scale. And actually numerically get the size of that gap, the ideal, what should be, and what is.
Yeah, so, I think that's great. I think people often struggle. Well, what do I ask? And knowing that part of the needs assessment is identifying a gap by framing the questions with that double scale, it does really help you then identify the gap.
And have an actual size. So the idea is, at the end, when you're looking at your survey results, you can see, for one, maybe how important is something to somebody and how distant is that from what's actually happening. So so you can then even, it can help you do something as simple as sort. How big is that gap? And then it's going to take some work. That's where the combination of quantitative and qualitative can be valuable, because your numbers might show you a gap. You might sort and say, I've got a big gap in these areas. But then the qualitative, when you're doing, and there's a bajillion different qualitative methods you can use. But even if you're just doing something as simple as a focus group or an interview, that gives you the opportunity to say, this is what showed up as being a big gap between what should be and what is. Is this something you think we should focus on? And maybe the answer is, well, I'd actually rather you focus a few more rows down. Help us to just make sense of those numbers and make sure we're not so reliant on our spreadsheet sorting that we're not listening to what people are actually saying. Yeah, that's true. No, and that's great. And it makes me wonder, right? So, we've identified that it's important. We're going to make time for needs assessment. We're going to do that in an inclusive way. So we're getting people from those who we need buy-in from to those who we're trying to help through the program. And we're looking at the preconditions and looking at the right methodologies. And now I've got data. What do I do with the data? How do I make sense of the data? How do I
take, as you had said at the top of our conversation, sometimes what the need is might be different from what you thought it was, or there may be multiple needs. How do we balance all that out?
Yeah, that's a good question. So this is where in the chapter we actually do recommend getting help if you can find it. And I mean, most people who are putting together a program, a mentoring or a training program, probably aren't data and analysis, quantitative data analysis experts. I'm not,
Right.
So so if you can get the help of, like in our office here, we have one of our student employees is a stats major.
Right.
Get some help from somebody who can actually take a look and help you with some of those things. That is the best approach. But generally speaking, we're pulling in, especially if we're using quantitative data, multi-scale questions. We're looking generally for discrepancy, so the size of the gap. We're looking for, whether it's the direction of it. We're looking for whether it's positive or negative. Maybe something's actually exceeding what people want, you know. Um,
Mhm.
maybe there's something we can capitalize there, or maybe we're seeing a need. So you want to kind of understand the direction of it, take a look at that. Look at how they relate to each other. So again, this is looking at, we're trying to basically get some sort of a quantitative sort
Right.
of our potential needs. And then we're trying to look at our demographic data to help make sense. So our surveys usually include some kind of demographic data to help us understand maybe why we're seeing what we're looking at. And then we also want to be looking at that with our qualitative feedback in mind.
Yeah.
And I mean, I guess if I were to just simplify it as much as possible, I'd say those would be the things that you're looking for and looking at to help you make sense of that data.
Yeah. It's almost, pulling all the pieces together to tell a story, right? So
Yeah,
we,
exactly.
yeah, yeah, that's great. Well, I think, I'm a bit of a needs assessment and evaluation nerd. Those are spaces where I like to spend some time. I always feel like the more information, the better. But I do find in my work that those are sort of, often the two key pieces that people skip. And so I really appreciate how the emphasis you put in this chapter on the value of a needs assessment, and knowing that there are going to be different ways we can approach it, and different resources to be able to do it. So before we go, I just want to say or ask, um, if we're thinking about creating a needs assessment process for a mentoring program, what is something that's going to be a must-have?
Yeah, that's a great question. So in the end, you're going to need to take all of this work and bring it down to a very specific end goal, end in mind. You're gonna, I mean, you really, I mean, needs assessment is really all about beginning your program with the end in mind. And so you really are going to want to, no matter what, make sure that one, you have the okay to spend a little bit of time to do the needs assessment. That two, you have a set boundary for your needs assessment. You need it to be able to move along quickly enough for people not to lose interest in the project overall.
Right.
And that needs to be communicated. So you need to have a good communication system, just to make sure people know this is happening and this is the result that you're gunning for. This is why you're doing it. Make sure you have committed people on your team who are going to help you see this process through, stakeholders who are going to help participate and help this happen. And then you're going to want to be able to make sure that they have the time to work through the data that you want to collect, the questions you want to have answered, work with you to analyze those. And then that they have a little bit of time to work with you to brainstorm, to do some brainstorming, because you're going to want to brainstorm, you're going to want to work together and kind of identify, one, what are your key priority needs? That's going to be your first big, like, reportable item. These are our priority needs that we are trying to address in this program. And then these are some potential solutions. You're going to want to have that team spend some time to do some brainstorming around potential solutions. Because then with that as your starting point, then the rest of the program can just flow from that. Is there anything else you would add, being a needs assessment and training nerd?
I love that. It's actually one of, Stephen Covey's, 12 habits of highly successful people is to begin with the end in mind. And I think once we get into the chapters on evaluation, having done the needs assessment is going to make that evaluation so easy when you have clarity on what it is you're trying to accomplish. And I think one of the points that you've just made is that a part of that process is ensuring that we are identifying that need at the very beginning and really having a group of people, whether that group ends up being one other person or 10 other people, who are going to help you in this process of having clarity from the beginning. So what I hear as like must have is clarity, right, on what our priority need is. And so that we are beginning with a really clear sense of where we want to go. So I absolutely hear that. So then if you think about somebody who's thinking, okay, I got the must have, what's a nice to have? If I don't have it, it's not going to be life or death, but would be a nice to have in this process.
Oh boy, that isn't it. This is where we can keep going, right? Because human wants are endless. Nice to have. Certainly it's always nice to have a little more time. It's nice to be able to, I find it's nice just from a project management perspective to have a sense of like what's more important, speed, high quality, or cheap.
Yeah.
You know, and the saying goes is you have to pick two, right? You have to give up one. And I know there's some people who push back on that maybe a little bit, but in reality, a lot of times, right, you have a choice between we can do this fast, we can do this cheap, and we can do this high quality. Which one do we have the ability to give up on if we have to?
And I think that's fair, right? We absolutely know that time is a premium for everyone. We all want more time. We know time is finite, or at least that's the mindset that we've adopted. We keep fighting against. But if you taking that step back that you talked about is about taking the time and giving yourself the time. Because I always believe, and I share with my clients all the time, if you don't put the time in up front, you most certainly are going to end up putting it in the back end when you're trying to fix or solve for things you had not prepared or planned for, right?
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, so more time is always better. it's always nice to have, I would say, good tools and good people, particularly around data analysis.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
really nice to have people who can do good data analysis to help you.
Yeah. So if I'm thinking about needs assessment for a mentoring program, what's something we can live without?
What's something we can live without? I'd say we can live without, and we probably will have to live without a massive committee.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I think a needs assessment process can, even though I've talked about having people, it is a collaborative exercise innately, but it might be a committee of one or two, like you said.
Right.
Because I mean, I can just hear the people who are listening to this or reading this saying, I'm in a small organization, I'm on a small campus,
Yeah.
or I'm in a small department, I wear 5 hats. And not only am I putting together a mentoring program, but I'm also recruiting and I don't know, whatnot.
Yeah.
So I can just hear that, and somebody saying, I can't bring together a group of 5 people. There's only 3 people in my office.
Right. Right.
So, I mean, we have to adjust for our circumstance, and I think we can we can live without a massive committee. Excuse me. But we can't live without getting input from people.
Right.
So maybe we aren't running a massive committee. Maybe we're running a committee of one, but we're not making everything up in our own head.
Right.
We're pulling input from stakeholders still,
Yeah.
in bursts. We're reaching out to them. If we
Yeah.
can get them all to participate with us through the whole process, awesome. But that's something we might
Yeah.
have to live without.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. I love that. Right. Because one, there certainly is risk in doing things by committee for sure. You definitely are going to need more time when you have more people involved in that process. And some folks may not have access to it, right? So it really is. I love that that there is a certain amount of being able to be the committee of one or maybe two, and a way we compensate for that is ensuring that as part of the process we are gathering input from stakeholders across the organization, where there's a certain amount investment in the process. So I love that, Neil. I think, like I said, I think this is such an important part of the process of building a mentoring program. And certainly with this book and these conversations, we're really trying to support and help people in that process. So I appreciate so much your contributions and your time to be here with me and our audience today to share. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much as well. This has been delightful. I've really appreciated it.
All right. Thank you, everyone. We will see you in our next chapter.